Finding Laura Bugs by Stanley Gordon West, Chapter 1. Come out, wherever you are. I was playing hide and seek with sudden death, and I didn't want to play. I had no choice. My life measured from heartbeat to heartbeat, from one breath to the next. Any moment he might open the door, and my life would be over. In a rage at finding me there, crouched in that ridiculous broom closet, he'd surely strangled me, while I was helpless to move. The trouble was I'd covered my trail. No one would be looking for me. I'd been careless, stupidly careless. Despite Clara's blaring old bugle, he'd surprised me, giving me a split second to duck into that stifling coffin. He was there, in the kitchen, inches from the narrow door that stood open a crack. I could hear him muttering to himself. He'd said I was a persistent girl. I'd taken it as a compliment, proud of my stubbornness. But it had all gone wrong, and my stubbornness would be the end of me. Why hadn't I left well enough alone, accepted my life for what it was? It was a good life. I had everything to live for, full of promise. People would sadly shake their heads when they'd see she was only 17 on my tombstone. Only I'd never have a tombstone. If he opened that broom closet door, I knew I'd dug my own grave in his fruit cellar, and I'd join my mother and father, disappearing as they had in that unmarked family plot. It was terrifying comedy. There I was, squatting on a pail, tangled with a broom handle and mop and dustpan, expecting him to find me second by second. Drenched in sweat and afraid I'd cough or sneeze, I dare move a muscle, didn't twitch. My breath echoed loudly in my skull, desperately fighting the panic welling in my throat. Struggling to calm myself, I thought back to how I ever got into this deadly mess. Page 2. The trouble began on my 12th birthday when my parents told me I was adopted. Actually, it was my mother who did the dirty work while my father awkwardly stood by. Awkward was pretty normal in our family, just me and the two of them. As far back as I could remember, I always felt an uneasiness between them, even before they spilled the beans. I don't know why they told me, as if the law required them to come clean, but maybe they felt I'd grown up enough to take it. Happy birthday, Sandy. You're not our kid. I don't know. I don't want to sound mean or anything. They were doing what they thought was the right thing, but it didn't make for a rip-roaring birthday. It felt like a total eclipse of my heart. All light, sucked from the life I knew. I wandered around in a daze for a while, trying to catch my breath. Like a can of food whose label had come off, you couldn't tell who I was. My world was topsy-turvy. Birds flew upside down, compass needles pointed due west, and 2 plus 2 was 7. This was the deal. My mother wasn't my mother. I'd gotten it wrong for 12 years. I thought of running away with the circus or hitchhiking to Duluth and stowing away on ocean-going freighter. I didn't tell any of my friends for over 2 years, and then one night at Jean Daly's slumber party, as if I was announcing I had leprosy, I told them. Judas Priest, they looked at me as though I'd hatched from an egg in some tropical swamp. By that time, I'd already started scrutinizing women who would be about my mother's age to see if I could detect any resemblance. It was a relief in some ways because I'd always felt I was oddly different from my parents, like we weren't from the same deck of cards. I often felt like a stranger in my own home, and one day when I asked my mother why I didn't have any sisters or brothers, she only said they thought one child was enough to raise. She was pretty frail and sick a lot, and it made sense to me at the time. The only time my father and I really talked was at the dinner table. It seemed he never could think of anything to say to me, and I was the same with him, and it was always slightly strained between us unless I could come up with something about plumbing and heating, or he could come up with something about school. But he never talked about his days at school or when he was a boy. We both were relieved when we came up with a common subject, like the mating call of the short-tailed albatross or regular verb forms of the Sino-Tibetan language. But this was the deal. I didn't know who my real parents were, didn't know if they were dead or alive, and didn't know who that made me. Some kids are adopted and never know it, and some who know it don't give a rip about who their real parents were. But I had to know. It was driving me crazy. I really tried to forget about it for almost 5 years, just push it out of my mind. And sometimes I wished They hadn't told me. But when I started my senior year at St. Paul Central High School, I realized that when you're adopted, there are two questions you can't bury or outrun. Why didn't they keep me? And who were they? I vowed to find out before I graduated, or I'd just die. If I'd imagined the horror I'd uncover and the danger I'd face, I might not have dared to start down the path into the forest. Might have chosen the safety of the sunlit meadow and been satisfied to be Sandy Meyer. But I never could have known where it would lead. Never wanted to hurt anyone, just find out who I was and my given name, the name my real mother gave me the day I was born, because I'd heard that's the name God knows you by. I'd try to let it die, but it had become a part of my heartbeat, and every breath I took, and something I couldn't name drew me like an unheard voice just below the surface. It really started that Friday afternoon, the first week of school. I had to stay an hour after school because the kids in Wallman's study hall set marbles on the slanted auditorium floor and scared the daylights out of her when they came roaring down when she was sitting at her little table. Gosh, she jumped up and started hopscotching around like she had hornets in her girdle, and we were falling out of our seats laughing so hard it hurt. When she figured out what was going on, she was really burned. Kids called her the Prussian general, and none of us could believe she'd dare to do it. Jerry Douglas, one of the senior wheels, passed out the marbles in front hall just before study hall. I was usually chicken when it came to doing something that took nerve, but I took one. When the big clock beside the stage clicked to 1:20, I held my breath and tried to set my marble on the wood floor, but I couldn't. My fingers wouldn't let go, and I clung to the marble with my sweaty fist and my chicken heart. All through the hour of detention, I berated myself for chickening out, and I felt like a traitor, acting as if I'd been part of it with the marble still in my skirt pocket. Anyway, I was late getting home. My mother had been in the hospital for almost 2 weeks in August, and I wanted to see that she was all right. Jean and I were going to the football game that night, and I wouldn't be home long. I ran the half block from the Randolph Hazel Park streetcar to our house on Bayard and found my mother in her bedroom, sitting in her rocker with an Afghan over her lap. She appeared pale and weak, but she looked that way a lot, and I had worried growing up that she would die. She was gazing at the picture of Amelia Earhart that sat framed on the dresser, the woman aviator who disappeared in 1937 in the South Pacific while attempting to fly around the world. People told Mother that she looked like Amelia, and there was a resemblance, but my mother was a lot skinnier. Amelia was her hero, and she was certain the Japs were holding her captive in some hidden dungeon. She wrote letters to the president and congressmen and the FBI and the Navy urging them to continue the search and rescue Amelia. It was one of my mother's quirks. "How are you, Mom?" "I'm just fine," she said. My mother had a way of saying she was fine that made you feel guilty for not seeing that she obviously wasn't. "Can I get you anything?" "I want you to come and sit for a minute," she said. I sat on the bed and felt something sticky in the air. The look on her gaunt face scared me, and I was afraid she was about to tell me she was dying. "Sandy, I know how important it is for you to know who your real parents were." Golly, she knocked the wind out of me. I'd done everything I could to never let on. Right from the start, I told them it didn't make any difference because I didn't want to hurt them and make them think I didn't love them. "I don't care about that, Mom." "You hush now and listen to me. I realized had I died in the hospital, you'd never know. Your father would never tell you. He's too ashamed." "You don't have to." "Hush." She held up her hand as if she were stopping traffic. "Let me say what I want to say while I have the gumption." She looked at me with such anguish, my throat went dry. "Your father was arrested and went to jail when he was a young man. He stole from the man he worked for. His family disowned him publicly, put a notice in the Pioneer Press. His parents and two brothers never spoke to him again, the family black sheep. When he got out of jail, he joined the army, but after he'd been in boot camp for several months, they found out that he'd been in jail and kicked him out. When we met, he told me all about it, and I could tell he'd learned his lesson. He was ashamed to have missed fighting in Europe with some of his friends." Page 6. Her voice broke, and she took a drink of water from the glass on the bedstand. "It doesn't matter, Mom. Let me get this out because I may never have the chance again." She took my hand, and hers felt cold and clammy, and she had a look on her face she had the day she told me the curse. After we were married, your father started out digging ditches with a pick and shovel, sewer lines, water lines, because no one else would hire him. We tried to have a baby for several years with no luck. Finally, the doctor told me I could never conceive, that we'd have to adopt if we wanted a family. But we knew no adoptive agency would accept your father. He was a felon. Just when we'd given up all hope, we found a lawyer who knew a man who had an 11-month-old baby girl whose mother was deathly ill. He was looking for a good home for the child, needed $970 to pay his wife's medical bills. We had to borrow some of the money. I was a black market baby? Not really, she said. She let go of my hand and waved hers lightly in the air. We just didn't go through the normal adoption agency. What was my family's name? We were never told, and it was all kept secret on both sides. Only the lawyer knew who they were, and he never told them who we were, so there could never be any trouble. Did my mother die? We don't know anything more about that. We took you home and loved you as much as anyone has loved their child, loved you as if I'd borne you with my own body and blood. You were the joy of my life. I'd take you for long walks in your buggy just so I could show you off to the neighbors, and strangers and everyone would tell me they never saw a more beautiful baby girl. She tilted her head slightly and looked at me as if I were still that pretty little girl. Why, I remember once, when you were about 3, I had you in pigtails and a pretty little dress at the Como Zoo in front of the bear cage. A man asked if he could take your picture. A perfect stranger. Said he'd never seen such an adorable child. I was so proud I almost burst. A snapshot of me, I said. Yes, people on the street were taken by you. I was so delighted. Your father kept saying that in a few years the boys would be lining up at the door. My dad didn't get that one right. My mother sighed. That's all I can tell you except one more thing. The name of the lawyer was Arnold Shapiro, an older man. I guess he'd be 70 or more by now, but I have no idea if he's still alive. My head felt like it was spinning. I squeezed my mother's hand and stood up. My throat was filling, and I was getting all emotional. I got to get ready for the game. I started out of the room. My chest felt like it had a truck parked on it, but I managed to smile. Thanks for telling me, Mom, but it really doesn't matter. I have my mom and dad. I could tell by her face how that pleased her, how I'd said the words she'd been hoping I'd say. One more thing, she said. Don't ever tell your father I told you. Never. He still carries the shame of it all. It would hurt him a great deal if he knew I told you. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. I bolted down the hall to my room and shut the door. I dove onto the bed and buried my face in the pillow and bawled. I don't know why, but I really bawled. And then suddenly I stopped and rolled over. I stared at the blurry ceiling. How would I ever find an old fuddy-duddy named Arnold Shapiro? I slipped my hand into my skirt pocket and found the marble, a reminder of my chicken heart. Where would I find the courage to go searching for my lost family?